Hello everyone, and welcome to the first lecture for the semester. In Chapter 1, we are going to be focusing on a general overview of the correction system, and we're going to look and see how this branch interacts with law enforcement and with the courts. We are then going to look at the different types of punishments that are available. We're going to explore recent trends in incarceration and some budgetary issues. You all have PowerPoints posted on the class website, so please follow along and take notes. Let's go ahead and get started. As we know, we commonly refer to the criminal justice system as a cohesive unit, even though technically there is not one complete system. There are a variety of different agencies that exist at both the state and federal level, all of which do a variety of different things. In addition to law enforcement, we know that the courts and the correctional systems all interact together as well. Even though this interaction occurs, these three areas are their own entities with their own oversight, their own budgets, and their own control. Beginning with law enforcement, this is an area of the criminal justice system that we have the most interaction with. Think about all of the regular things that police do on a daily basis that aren't even really a law enforcement function. Police officers are often called out to do things like welfare checks, or they have to regulate traffic if the stoplight goes out. Their major function is investigating crimes, but there is so much more that these individuals have to do beyond that simple function. Law enforcement exists at the state, local, and federal levels. Often individuals serve a specific purpose, such as handling drug offenses for the DEA or other things for different agencies. But no matter how specialized or how general their purpose, law enforcement serves the general purpose of initiating criminal cases that then move on to the courts. The court system is probably the area of the criminal justice system that we will then have the second most interaction with. Think about how many courts there are that aren't even necessarily just regular criminal courts. They handle so much more than just processing criminal cases. Do you want to get married? Do you want to get divorced? You have to go to court and you have to file the necessary paperwork to do those things. Grandma just died and is everybody fighting over their inheritance? Well, you're going to have to go to probate court. Let's say that you get that inheritance and then you blow through all the money and you eventually go bankrupt. Well, now you have to go to bankruptcy court. But if we're talking about criminal cases, as we are in this class, we will then have an individual who has been arrested by the police and then is charged by the prosecutor or the district attorney. The defendant then has the right to defend him or herself, and the court oversees a decision that is being made regarding the guilt of that defendant, all the while making sure that the court proceedings are lawful and are not in violation of the defendant's constitutional rights. Every year we see a large amount of people who are being transitioned through the court system, resulting in an estimated 1.2 million convictions a year, the majority of which take place at the state level rather than at the federal one. If we look at this chart here on the slide, what trends do you notice? We can see that there is an upward trend of people who are being convicted in court. This can be through a full trial process or through a plea deal. More of these convictions come from plea deals than through actual trials. Once they are convicted, then a good proportion of them are going to be incarcerated or supervised at the very least. This upward trend continues even though we do see media reports in which mass prison releases are occurring. But, as we will learn later, the majority of these convictions result in a community correction sentence rather than an incarceration sentence. So, once you are convicted, then the correctional system is going to take over your case. A defendant can have interactions with the correction system at both the pre- and post-trial environments. This means that the court and the correctional systems are going to supervise you from the moment you are charged until you complete the trial and your remaining sentence, if there is one. Think about this. If you don't make bond, you are going to have to stay in jail until your court hearing. That's the correctional system at work. If you are convicted and are sentenced to 15 years in prison, the correctional system will once again supervise you. Whether or not that is a local, state, or federal facility will depend on the nature of your charges and what jurisdiction you are being prosecuted by. Although there are different constitutional considerations that we will discuss this semester, the Eighth Amendment is one of the most important when we discuss corrections and punishment. The Eighth Amendment is known as the Corrections Amendment. It has been implemented to make sure that you are safeguarded from excessive punishments. To you, the punishment might seem excessive since you are the one who has to serve it. But the state Supreme Court and SCOTUS rules on whether or not these laws actually violate constitutional rights. They are called proportionality reviews. In other words, does the punishment fit the crime? Two of the biggest issues that we see in relation to the Eighth Amendment are the use of the death penalty and the more recent three strikes legislation that keeps popping up across the country. We will discuss these more in detail later on, but for those of you who are unfamiliar with three strikes legislation, this essentially means that if you commit 3 felonies, you can be sentenced to a life sentence in prison upon the conviction of your third. 3 strikes in the death penalty statute show extreme examples of punishment, but they do fall within the continuum of sanctions that are used in the country today. Based on the crime that you commit, the circumstances surrounding that crime, and your personal history, all of these things have an impact on the sentence that you will receive. If there are any aggravating or mitigating factors involved, that will have an impact on your sentence as well. Aggravating factors increase the severity of the offense and the subsequent punishment. On the other hand, mitigating factors are going to decrease the severity. For instance, aggravating factors consist of things like having a weapon present at the crime, having multiple victims, working with co-defendants, or the age of the victim that you offend against. Mitigating factors will then include the defendant's age, the defendant's IQ level, or if the defendant had a history of abuse. But more so than anything else, the main predictor of punishment is the individual's level of criminality. Your book definition states that criminality refers to the propensity towards antisocial behavior that the defendant embodies. But what does that really even mean? If we take a look at criminality, there are many things that are involved. Research suggests that there are different aspects to a person's personality and their social status that all have an impact on their level of criminality. For example, looking at this slide, we will see that those who are unemployed, those who come from single-parent homes, belong to low socioeconomic statuses, or have a history of mental illness, have prior records, and are younger, all of those factors lend to a person who has higher crime rates compared to their social counterparts. These are not absolutes. They do not mean that you're automatically going to commit a crime, but they are highly correlated with higher levels of crime rates overall. So now, let's talk about what common punishments are available for defendants convicted of offenses. Even though the correctional system is huge, we see more convicted individuals serving community correction sentences than we do serving incarceration sentences. When we talk about community corrections, we are commonly referring to probation and parole. But you can still throw in some other sanctions like house arrest in there. But generally, these individuals are still supervised by a probation or a parole officer. These sanctions allow for the offender to be in the community rather than being incarcerated. These programs are much more cost-effective than incarceration. Let's take Texas as an example and look at that for a moment. The corrections budget just for the state of Texas was $3.1 billion for the fiscal year 2014. Currently in Texas, it costs about $1.56 a day to supervise an offender on community correction supervision. That equates to $569.40 per year. To incarcerate a low-level, low-security offender, it costs about $51 a day in the state of Texas, which equates to roughly $18,615 a year. So, if we look at the cost breakdown, 1 month of community correction supervision is equivalent to 1 day of incarceration. This is a major benefit for community corrections, but also one of the biggest downsides to community correction supervision is the violation rate. Violations are higher for community correction offenders than for incarcerated inmates. Probationers and parolees are living on their own. There is a variety of things that they could get into without their probation or parole officer knowing about. In prison, there is a lot less opportunity for inmates to do whatever they want, even though they will still try. But there are more opportunities for community correction offenders to be rehabilitated. For example, drug offenders are often required to attend drug treatment programs while living in the community. There isn't enough funding in an incarceration budget to often provide treatment to prison inmates. One of the issues with community corrections is its extreme growth. The growth of community correction sentences has exploded more than 400% since 1980. But given this growth, do you think that supervision has gotten better or has gotten worse with the increase of people living in the community? Even though the population has gotten larger, the resources to actually supervise the individuals has not grown in the same way. More than 5 million people are currently on community correctional supervision, but only 15% of the budget, on average, is dedicated to the supervision of these 5 million people. That means that the resources are often spread quite thin. Let's once again turn our attention to the Texas budget. Once again, as we stated before, Texas has received $3.1 billion for their budget to account for correctional costs. These figures are coming from fiscal year 2014. The majority of that money has to go towards incarceration supervision, as shown on this chart. That makes sense, as prisons are expensive to run. These facilities need food, they need clothing, medical supplies, supervision, and a variety of other things that need to be done within the actual facility. That costs more money because a facility is a fixed place. Community corrections are a very different story. If on average we just said the state budgets are roughly 15% for community corrections, that is not something that is happening here in Texas. 15% of $3.1 billion comes out to be about $465 million. For fiscal year 2014, the state only has $279 million allocated. So that means they're about $186 million shy of the national average. If you include parole into the mix, which often we don't, then you're only going to be about $30 million shy. Many other states are having similar budget issues. The overall budgets keep decreasing, and the majority of the funds are being needed for incarceration supervision. This means that community corrections keep being left behind. We will talk more about probation later on this semester, but probation is a separate sentence from incarceration. This is often confused with parole. People get these two mixed up all the time. But in reality, these are very different things, even though the main bones of the two are very similar. Think of it this way: probation is a separate sentence, whereas parole is the continuation of a prison sentence that will be continued in the community. If the offender violates the terms of his or her probation, then they can be violated and they have to serve a short jail sentence as punishment for that violation. Most of the time, the PO will be a little lenient when deciding whether or not they're going to violate. Everything is up to the discretion of the PO, and they decide how much of a violation they're going to move forward with. You might come back with a dirty UA, but I won't violate you in court until your third dirty UA. You might get community service or some other type of punishment, but the PO does have the ability to recommend violation on the first time an offender does violate the terms of their probation. As we just stated, parole is the continuation of a prison sentence that can be continued in the community. This is a cheaper solution than requiring the offender to finish out the remainder of the prison sentence in the actual prison. However, like probationers, parolees are still required to be supervised by the state, and they are still required to comply with the terms of their parole, or they could have their parole revocated. All states are a little different for how they use parole. It's not really the preferred option anymore because there have been some cases of parolees who go out and they commit a much worse crime because they weren't being supervised enough. Parolees are the most high-risk group of correctional clients that we have because they have been incarcerated already. This typically signals that a more severe offense has been committed. In order for an offender to be released on parole, a state or federal parole board typically reviews the inmate's case and makes a determination for release. The federal system technically does not even have parole anymore. It was ended in 1984, but there are still people in prison who are eligible for parole, so they have to keep it an option until the very last eligible inmate is out of prison. The federal system now uses determinate sentences. This is something that we're going to cover much more in depth in Chapter 4. But in states that still use parole, there are two ways in which an offender can be released. First, there is the function of mandatory parole. This means that after an offender serves a percentage of their sentence, time has run out and the state must release you. On the other hand, the state can also release you via discretionary parole. This means that after a certain amount of time, the offender is now eligible for parole, but the parole board determines whether or not you should be released early. The offender can be denied the opportunity to be released and will be sent back to his or her cell to continue to serve his or her prison sentence. Finally, the last thing I would like to discuss briefly is the idea of jail and prison sentences. Jail is used for short-term sentences. These are normally operated by the local authorities, and they often house misdemeanor offenders. This means that they are there for an incarceration sentence of less than a year. Jails are also used for pretrial supervision and for detaining offenders before they are transferred to their final prisons. Prisons, on the other hand, are for long-term offenders, which means that the offender has been convicted of a felony offense that has an incarceration sentence of a year and a day or longer. Prisons are run by the state or by the federal government. Those convicted of federal offenses are incarcerated in prisons that are run by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, or the FBOP. There is some debate as to whether or not the conditions are better in jails or in prisons. Many inmates state that they would prefer to be in a prison rather than in a jail, as it is much more permanent and it's often more steady in terms of treatment. Although neither facility is an ideal place to be, there are some benefits to prison that your book describes, and we will discuss later on when we turn our attention to incarceration. In this lecture, we explored a brief overview of the correctional system and its place in connection with law enforcement and with the courts. We then turned our attention to recent trends in incarceration and the steep increase in felony convictions since the 1980s. The reasons for these increases are abundant. Based on this increase, we then had to discuss budgetary issues that are associated with less money and often more offenders that need to be supervised. We finished the lecture discussing the different types of punishment available, such as probation and incarceration sentences. In the next lecture, we're going to focus our attention on the history of corrections and how our system has evolved over time. So join me next time when we take a closer look at Chapter 2.